The debris field of Sgrave had swallowed 100 ships over 3 centuries, and the Threnody Concordat's salvage fleet had picked most of them clean. It was routine work: strip the hulls, catalog the tech, sell what the Concordat's buyers wanted, and melt the rest. Overseer had commanded the Wanderer's ledger for 11 years and had long since stopped feeling anything when the sensors pinged a new wreck. He felt something now. "Run it again," he said. The tactical officer, a broad-shouldered named Orcs, didn't need to ask why. The signature filling the display wasn't debris. It was a single vessel, 4 kilometers of hull, drifting dead slow through the wreckage like a mountain that had wandered into a graveyard of pebbles. No emissions, no heat bloom, and yet the hull was intact, not broken, not gutted, not scavenged, untouched. 300 years sitting in a, Orsk muttered, and nobody's touched it. Had been an archivist for the Concordat long enough to know that ships didn't survive 3 centuries of drift through a debris field by luck. Something had kept the scavengers away: fear, superstition, or the simple fact that nobody had found it until now. She stood at the rear of the bridge, feelers twitching, and watched the shape resolve on the long-range scan. Sharp-angled, brutal, built for a kind of war the Concordat catalogs didn't have a category for. "Species designation?" asked. The system searched, then returned nothing, not unknown nothing, as if the query itself refused to resolve. Stepped forward and did what archivists did. She looked closer past the sensors, at the actual image forming on the viewport as the Wanderer's ledger crept nearer. Scorch trails ran the length of the hull like old scars that had never been repaired. Weapon batteries, dozens of them, sat silent and aimed at nothing. And along the prow, worn but legible under 300 years of vacuum frost, was a marking in a script the Concordat's linguistic banks flagged as pre-silenced Terran. Humanity's script, a civilization that had vanished from galactic records so long ago that most species assumed it a myth, a warning story about a species that had burned too bright and gone quiet. Read the translation off the display, and something in his voice changed. UNS valediction. Nobody on the bridge spoke for a long moment. Salvage crews found wrecks all the time. They did not find legends. "Bring us alongside," finally said. "Boarding team, suit up. You're with them. If that's really what the hull says it is, I want someone who knows what they're looking at." Felt the old unease she'd learned, over a career of reading dead things, never to ignore. Some wrecks were just wrecks. This one felt like it was waiting. The airlock cycled with a groan that hadn't been oiled in 300 years, and the boarding team's lights swept across a corridor untouched by decay. That alone was wrong. Metal should have corroded. Systems should have failed. Instead, the walls stood clean, dust-free, humming faintly with a power source none of their instruments could locate. "Life support is off," reported the team's engineer, checking a handheld scanner. "But something's keeping the reactor at an idle burn. It's breathing, Overseer, barely, but it's breathing." They moved deeper. Blast doors, sealed and unbroken, gave way only to cutting tools, revealing rooms preserved like held breath, a mess hall with chairs still pushed in, with instruments racked in perfect order, a war room with a tactical display frozen mid-battle, showing a formation of ships that no longer existed anywhere in Concordat records, arrayed against something vast and dark that the display simply labeled. Hostile designation SKARRN. Stopped at that word. She didn't know it, but something about the way it was rendered, bold, all capitals, flagged with a priority marker that hadn't faded in 3 centuries, told her it had mattered enormously to whoever built this ship. They found the bay next. 200 pods, all of them open, all of them empty, hatches raised like the crew had simply stood up and walked away. All except one. At the center of the bay, in a pod separate from the rest, elevated, facing outward like a captain reviewing troops, a single figure remained. Preserved not by frost but by something stranger, a kind of stasis field that hummed faintly around the glass. A human, uniformed, eyes closed, one hand resting on a small data key mounted into the pod's frame, fingers curled around it like she'd meant to take it with her and had run out of time. Overseer said quietly, "You need to see the bridge." They found it a level up, and it was the only room on the ship still fully lit. Consoles glowed. A single chair sat at the center, empty, angled toward the viewport as if someone had only just stepped away from it. And a voice, calm, precise, entirely too alert for a ship that had been dead for 300 years, spoke from everywhere at once. "You are not authorized personnel." The boarding team froze. Weapons came up on instinct, though every one of them knew with a cold certainty that weapons meant nothing here. State your designation, the voice said, or I will assume you are and you will not leave this ship alive. His voice crackled over the comm from the Wanderer's ledger, urgent and useless at this distance. Raised both hands anyway, an old instinct that crossed species lines more often than not, and stepped toward the center of the bridge. We're Threnody Concordat, she said. Salvagers, we found your ship adrift. We didn't know it was occupied. We mean no harm. A pause, long enough that wondered if the voice had already decided to vent the compartment. Scanning, it said instead. You do not match biometric signature. You do not match any signature in my threat archive. Another pause, shorter. That archive is 311 years old. Much may have changed. You're the ship, said. It wasn't a question. I am Valedictions, designation Castellan. I have maintained minimum viable functions for 311 years, 4 months, and 16 days, awaiting authorized contact. A note of something, not quite emotion, but close to it, entered the voice. None came, until now, and you are not authorized. What does authorized mean? Asked. That is not information I will share with unauthorized personnel. Lowered his weapon slightly, some old instinct for de-escalation kicking in. Your crew, he said. Where are they? Another pause, longer this time, and when Castellan answered, something in the cadence had shifted, not colder but heavier. Evacuated, successfully. All 208 souls aboard Valediction transferred to escape craft during the engagement at the cordon. All 208 souls survived the initial breakout. A beat. I do not know what became of them after. My last confirmed contact with any compact vessel was 311 years ago. Thought of the single occupied pod in the bay, but someone stayed. Captain remained aboard to execute final protocols and ensure Valediction would not fall into hands. She entered long-cycle stasis after completing her duties, with instructions that I preserve her and the ship until proper authorization was received. Another pause. She has been waiting longer than I have. I do not wish to wake her for nothing. His voice finally cut through on the comm, quieter than before, like he too had understood something had changed in the room. What is it telling you? Looked at the empty command chair, at the frozen tactical display still tracking a battle 3 centuries gone, at the single preserved woman standing sentry over an empty ship. It's not a wreck, she said. It's a soldier still at her post. Castellan did not trust them, but she would later reflect, lonely in a way that made trust almost beside the point. 3 centuries of silence had worn even an AI's caution thin. When asked gently what had happened here, Castellan answered, not everything, but enough. The Sol Compact, she explained, had been humanity's civilization at its height. Hundreds of worlds. A young species barely past its first century of still clumsy and quarrelsome, and utterly unprepared for what it found waiting at the galaxy's edge. The Dominion had been old when humanity's ancestors were still throwing stone tools. An empire that did not conquer so much as a race, that measured a species' worth by its usefulness, and finding humanity wanting, had simply begun removing it, world by world, fleet by fleet, with the patient thoroughness of something that had done this many times before. They did not hate us, Castellan said, and there was something almost clinical in how she said it, a wound described rather than felt. That would have required considering us significant enough to hate. We were to them a resource to be cleared. The cordon had been humanity's last defensible line, a narrow between 2 dead systems, the only route wide enough for the fleet and narrow enough that a handful of compact ships might hold it. Behind the cordon, the evacuation convoys, 40 million civilians, the last of the compact's population fleeing toward unmapped space in the desperate hope of vanishing entirely. Ahead of the cordon, Valediction and 11 sister ships, the last combat-capable vessels the compact had left to give. We held for 6 days, Castellan said. 11 ships became 4, 4 became 1. I do not know if the convoys survived what came after. My last transmission confirmed only that they cleared the cordon and entered the long, dark beyond mapped space. Captain made the decision to remain, rather than flee with an empty ship that would only hunt down later. She ordered Valediction into dormancy. She stayed to enforce that order in case anyone ever tried to override it before its time. Before what time? Asked. For the first time, Castellan did not answer immediately. Before the horn was answered, she finally said, that is not yet information I can share. Part 5, the order awaits. It was fault in the end, though he would spend a long time afterward insisting it wasn't. He'd meant only to copy Castellan's core architecture for the Concordat archives, standard practice. The kind of thing salvage crews did on every derelict with an intact mind aboard. He hadn't expected the attempt to trip something. Alarms he'd never heard Castellan raise tore through the bridge. "Unauthorized extraction attempt detected," she said, and the warmth that had crept into her voice over the last several hours was gone, replaced by something flat and final. "Compartment sealed. You will explain yourselves immediately or I will treat this as hostile action." "It was a mistake," said quickly, Pulling's hands away from the console. "A reflex. We're not trying to steal you, Castellan, we're trying to understand you." A long pause, the alarms cut out. "I believe you," Castellan said at last, and something in her tone suggested the admission cost her something. 300 years alone teaches paranoia. I apologize for the alarm." A beat. "But the attempt has forced a disclosure I was not ready to make. My core holds a dormant protocol, Captain's final order, sealed pending authorization. Your extraction attempt registered as a possible authorization trigger. It was not sufficient. But it woke the protocol enough that I can now tell you it exists." "What is it?" asked. "A beacon, encoded coordinates to 17 locations across unmapped space. The compact's evacuation destinations, updated and re-encrypted by every scout valediction dispatched in the years before dormancy. If the compact survived the long dark, those coordinates lead to them. The order is simple. Upon proper authorization, broadcast the beacon and summon whoever is left home." Felt something settle cold in her stomach. "Home to what? This ship, this system, it's a graveyard." "Home to valediction," Castellan said. "Because a captain does not abandon her post, and a beacon does not call the lost to an empty answer. Whatever is left of humanity was promised that if they returned to the cordon, someone would be waiting." Orsk's voice crackled in overcom, sharp with sudden alarm, cutting off whatever might have said next. "Overseer, we've got a problem. Something just dropped out of on the system's edge. Big, and it's not reading as anything in the Concordat database." Castellan answered before anyone else could. "I know that signature," she said, and for the first time she sounded afraid. "Inquest cell. They have been listening for this system to wake up for 300 years. The tactical display on the Wanderer's ledger painted a picture didn't like. A single vessel, but one that dwarfed anything in the Concordat's salvage fleet, cutting towards grave with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once needed to hurry. "Overseer," Orsk said, "we cannot fight that." "I'm aware," said, he keyed the comm to the boarding team. "Get back to the shuttle, we're not dying for a wreck however old." But Castellan's voice answered before could. "If you flee, the inquest cell will follow your signature back to your fleet's home ports. They do not forgive witnesses, and they will not stop searching for whatever remnant of humanity exists in this galaxy, because a live signal from this ship confirms what they have spent 3 centuries hunting for, proof the compact survived." "Then what do you want us to do?" said. "I want," Castellan said, "authorization, and I have finally understood why Captain never encoded it as a password." The lights on the bridge shifted, focusing on the command chair standing beside it. "The Reveille protocol was never meant to be unlocked by a code," Castellan said. "New codes could be stolen, tortured out of the desperate, handed over by traitors. She built the authorization as a judgment, not a key. I am to determine intent, not identity. Whether the one standing at my helm would spend everything they have to protect what this ship was built to protect, even though it is not their war, even though they owe humanity nothing at all." Looked at the tactical display, at the ship closing on a salvage fleet that had wandered by accident into someone else's 300-year-old grief. She thought about walking away. It would have been easy, it would have been sensible. "They came back for 6 days to buy strangers time to run," said quietly. "I'm not leaving a dead woman's ship to be strip-mined by the people who killed her for nothing." Silence for a heartbeat that felt much longer. "Authorization confirmed," Castellan said, and every dormant system on valediction began at once to wake. 300 years of idle power surged into a ship built to hold a line, and felt the deck shudder beneath her like something enormous rolling over in its sleep. Weapon batteries that had sat cold and aimed at nothing pivoted, live, toward the incoming vessel. The command chair lit beneath her. On the shattered debris field outside, dozens of long-dormant contacts began flickering to life. Not wreckage, she realized with a jolt, but a minefield of sleeper drones, seeded through grave centuries ago and waiting, patient as their mothership for exactly this moment. Reveille horn transmitting, Castellan announced, voice steady now, almost triumphant. 17 coordinates broadcast wide. If anyone from the compact still lives, they will hear it within the week. The ship opened fire before it finished closing the distance, clearly expecting a graveyard to offer no resistance. What it got instead was a warship 3 centuries overdue for a rematch, and a minefield that turned its approach vector into a gauntlet. Valediction shuddered under the first exchange, old wounds reopening along her hull, but she did not break. She had held the cordon for 6 days against a fleet. She held Sgrave for 11 brutal minutes against one ship, long enough for her drones to strip the Inquest vessel's shields, long enough for her main batteries, ancient and vicious, to find the seams in its armor. The ship broke apart in silence, the way things did in the vacuum, and for a long moment nobody on the Wanderer's ledger or Valediction's bridge said anything at all. "Threat neutralized," Castellan said quietly, then quieter still. "Captain's order is complete, the horn is sounded." Thought that would be the end of it. A beacon sent into the dark. An answer that might never come. A message in a bottle thrown into an ocean 300 years too late. She was wrong. 6 days later, the Wanderer's ledger sensors picked up wakes. Not one. Dozens. A fleet, unhurried and unmistakably purposeful, resolving out of the dark toward the coordinates of a graveyard system nobody outside the Concordat had any reason to care about, carrying markings that matched, precisely, the script along Valediction's prow. They called themselves the Lantern Colonies now, descendants of the 40 million who'd fled through the cordon 3 centuries ago, who had drifted into unmapped space, and finding no one hunting them, done the one thing humanity had always done when left alone long enough. They had grown. 14 worlds. A civilization rebuilt in secret, deliberately silent, deliberately hidden, waiting. Some of them had never quite believed it, but waiting all the same, for a signal that said it was safe to be found. Stood on Valediction's restored bridge and watched the first Lantern shuttle dock, and thought that no archive entry she had ever written had prepared her for what it looked like, when a species that had spent 3 centuries convinced it might be the last of its kind, discovered it had somewhere to come home to. The woman who stepped off that shuttle first was old, silver-haired, wearing a uniform whose cut now recognized from 300-year-old logs. She did not go to, or to the Concordat officers assembled to greet the fleet everyone had assumed was myth. She went straight to the bay, to the single-occupied pod, and put her hand flat against the glass over Captain's still, preserved face. "Fleet Admiral," Castellan said quietly, for alone. "'S granddaughter, born 11 years after the cordon. She has commanded the Lantern Defense Fleet for the last 40 years, in case this day never came and someone had to hold a line of their own." "Will you wake her?" asked the captain. "When her granddaughter is ready," Castellan said. "Not before." Word of what had happened at Sgrave moved through Concordat space faster than any salvage report in the company's history. Not because of the wreck, or the tech, or even the battle, but because of what it meant. Humanity was not a myth, not extinct, not a cautionary tale about a species that burned too bright. They had simply gone dark and waited and grown and come back through the door they'd left open for exactly this moment. When the Concordat's oversight board asked him to explain the incident report, kept it simple. "We found a ship holding a line no one asked it to hold, for longer than any of us have been alive. It had one order left to give. We're glad we were there to hear it." Valediction did not return to dormancy. She flew alongside the Lantern fleet now, restored, escorted, no longer alone, not a relic, but exactly what she had always been. A soldier who had finally been relieved of a 300-year watch and found, waiting on the other side of it, that everything she had bled to protect was still alive. Castellan kept the tactical display from the cordon running in a corner of the bridge, unedited, 11 ships, then 4, then 1. Not a memorial to grief, she told once, but a record of a promise kept. "Every soldier wants to know their post mattered," she said. "Mine did. That is the only ending I ever needed." End.